And good morning, everybody. It is that time. Actually, we're just about 10 seconds early here. So, good morning and welcome to Adult Sunday School as we are trying to make sense of the Bible, understanding the Bible. This is basically a class in hermeneutics. That's what we would call it in seminary, which means first things first, understanding first things. And you have to understand, before you can really begin to understand and interpret the Bible, you have to have background information. You have to do some foundational kinds of things. That is the essence of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So today, we're going to get into who actually wrote Paul's letters. Now, you might think, oh, this is a trick question. Who wrote Paul's letters? Well, obviously, Paul did, because that's why we call them the epistles of the Apostle Paul. Well, we need to come to a little bit of an understanding about that. So, for example, do you know, we know for a fact that Paul dictated many of his letters. He did not write them himself, he dictated them, and somebody else took that down. You think, well, they had dictation back then? Sure, they did. Those people were called scribes. And some of Paul's writings seem to be word for word, while others seem like other people took his ideas and put them into words that seem best to them, taking their ideas and reshaping them. And some people actually think that some people took his ideas and they composed his letters in his name after his death. So, this is a serious topic, one that we need to take into consideration. And before we start to delve into the writings of Paul and understand what's there. So, when you're writing, handwriting, one of the keys to handwriting is your eyesight, your vision. People that have macular degeneration can tell you this. When you start having trouble with your eyes, you also have problems with your handwriting. People with macular degeneration will start to write slower and larger. And some scholars believe that Paul suffered from some sort of an affliction like that. Maybe it was macular degeneration. And that is one reason why he dictated some of his letters rather than write them himself. Galatians, for example, in chapter 6, verse 11, says, "See what large letters I make when I am writing in my own hand." So Galatians is one letter that we believe that Paul may have written on his own. And in Galatians 4, verse 15, Paul says, in testimony of the Galatians' goodwill towards him, he says, "You would have torn out your own eyes and given them to me." That seems like a reference to the fact that they were concerned about the problem Paul had with his eyesight. So this has led to speculation among scholars over the years that Paul had some sort of an eye problem, one way or the other. And the evidence would seem to point that way. Either way, Paul used a scribe often, and he sometimes mentions these people. In the book of Romans, for example, in chapter 16, verse 22, he mentions Tertius as his scribe. In 1 Corinthians, in the book of Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians, Paul says he's writing those himself. He makes reference to that. But as far as dictating and having a scribe, a good personal assistant, a person who's really good at this type of thing, someone who has been with you for a while, who knows you, who knows your vocabulary, knows how you use words, they know your style of writing because they've written it down so much, they've listened to it so much. Those people can actually write letters for you and sign them. Sometimes you tell those people, okay, you know what needs to be said here. Write it down the way I would say it, and I'll sign it. So they do, and they do. The person didn't actually write the letter, but it's their ideas. They look at it and they say, yeah, that's what I want said, and they sign it. And by signing it, they're saying, this is my letter. These are my thoughts. I'm in agreement with this. So Now, on some occasions, Paul had other people that were with him writing for him. Some may have taken down his words dictation style, word for word, as best they possibly could. Now, the book of Second Corinthians is interesting because Second Corinthians is believed to be what we call a mashup, a composite of at least two, maybe three letters that were edited together into one, and that was done probably sometime after Paul's death. Well, if that's the case, you got to ask the question, well, why? Why would somebody do that? Well, it could be that one letter was partially damaged or lost. Remember, they're writing these things down on papyrus. They're very fragile, they're easily damaged. Fires happen often, and things could be lost or damaged. And in the course of copying, people get interrupted, and maybe they don't go back to something, and so these letters were, however Paul had them put down, they were copied. Copies were made, just like we make books. Copies were made by hand, and then they were sent to other churches in the area. And so when you have that happen, well, a lot of interesting things can happen, can get done. People can take an idea and change it, say, yeah, Paul used kind of clumsy language there. I'm going to change this around a little bit and clarify this. Or in the case of Second Corinthians, we're going to we want to get both of these letters out, so we're going to put them together and send them off together as one. Some Catholic scholars debate Pauline authorship on the book of Ephesians, Colossians, Second Thessalonians, First and Second Timothy, and Titus. The last of those three are what are known as pastoral epistles or prison epistles. So, well, and why do they do that? Why are they questioned? Well, the theology, for example, in those disputed letters sounds different than what Paul talks about in other places. Also, the vocabulary is different. There are words used that you don't normally see Paul used in those letters. For example, I do not use the word ain't unless I am trying to make some kind of a point. And so it basically, I grew up as a kid saying it, but it's been scrubbed pretty much from my vocabulary. If I use it intentionally for some kind of a reason. I don't use it because it's a common word within my vocabulary. But if you were to receive, let's say, an email with my name on it, and the word ain't is in there, well, you have grounds to question the authenticity of that email because you know that I simply don't use that kind of language. In fact, if you receive any kind of an email that does not sound pastoral, you have good reasons to doubt either the authenticity or my state of mind at the time that I wrote the thing. And that happens too. But the same thing is true with Paul. Certain words show up in his disputed letters that don't show up in the undisputed letters. Now, another is a difference in ideas. I have a friend, in fact, I've got several friends, who are, in terms of their politics, are conservative Republicans through and through, absolutely. And if I were to receive an email from one of them with their name on it, and the email is inviting me to make a contribution to Joe Biden's campaign, I would know that their email had been hacked. Either that or they were trying to play some sort of a practical joke on me, because I know them and I know seriously they would never, ever in all of creation do such a thing. It's totally contrary to who they are and what they think. So, the differences in the disputed letters then of Paul involve vocabulary, the style of writing, theological ideas, and guidance that he gives that doesn't show up in the undisputed letters. And you've got to wonder, now, why would Paul say something like that? Is that really Paul saying that? So the idea that several of Paul's letters were written after his time and in his name, now that bothers some Christians. They think, boy, that just cannot be, because if it is, then that throws off the whole authenticity and authority of the Scripture for me. Well, if that concerns you, think about this. The Lovers Lane United Methodist Church down in Dallas, Texas, was founded in the 1940s. It was founded by a pastor by the name of Tom Shipp. He was the founding pastor of that church. And he was the pastor of that church for 31 years. I cannot begin to imagine being in the same place for 31 years. I did 10 years one place and it just about killed me. No, it's just not my DNA to think of somebody that would do something like that. 31 years. He was the beloved founding pastor of that congregation, and he died of a heart attack in a committee meeting. Died with in the stirrups, and the church was, of course, grieved, and they never forgot their founding pastor. Now, fast forward 21 years. And Stan Copeland, very well-known, well-respected pastor, is now the pastor of Lovers Lane Church in Dallas. And he learns that the founding pastor, Tom Shipp, dictated his sermons into a dictaphone and would have them then typed up for his minutes, for his notes for Sunday morning. And the week that he died, he had his sermon about 2/3 of the way done and dictated into the dictaphone. So Stan got this idea that he would preach Tom Shipp's last sermon. So, and he finished it, the last third of it, by taking Tom's ideas that were being shared in the first part of the sermon, and he adapted them to a totally new generation. Now, the Dallas Morning News, don't ask me how, but somehow, some way, they got wind of this, and they did an advanced story on, and they entitled the story, "The Sermon from the Other Side." Very appropriate around Halloween, wouldn't you think? And, Tom Shipp has been dead and in heaven for 21 years. But over 2,000 people showed up to hear that message. So, here's the question. Was it Tom Shipp's sermon, or was it Stan Copeland's sermon? It was Tom Shipp's ideas, and 2/3 of the words were his, but the conclusion and the ideas were revised at the end by Stan Copeland to speak to a new generation. So whose sermon was it? Well, this is how I see the letters of Paul. Paul's letters that are in question in terms of whether or not he actually wrote them, or if they were written after he died. Who could or would take Paul's words and his ideas and adapt them to another group of people, another generation? Well, I think people who knew him and knew him well, people who worked with him, people like Timothy, Silvanus, Sosthenes, Tertius, people like that. Tertius, who actually served as his scribe, for example. Timothy, who was certainly one of his intimates. John Mark was good at that, having written his own gospel, taking down the ideas of Peter. Maybe he was involved in this somehow, some way. The point is the development of the biblical texts as we have them today, be they Old Testament or New Testament, are a lot more complex and I think intriguing than what most people suppose. Most people don't even want to think about that. They just say the Bible's the Bible and I accept it on faith and I don't want to know about any of this other stuff. I don't like that kind of simplistic thinking. For myself personally, if that's the way you want to think, that's okay. It's a free country, you can do that. But the fact is, the Bible did not just drop out of heaven as it is, as we have it today, for us. it was a process. And I don't believe it was a matter of God whispering in the ear of the people who wrote it. Biblical documents were written and they were edited by people who were addressing the needs of the people of their time and their particular circumstances. These writings, I fully believe that they are inspired by God. I believe that in them and through them, God continues to speak to us today. That's not an issue. That's not a problem. But the process by which they come to us is a lot more complicated and complex than what most people would like to believe and most people think. And so, and I think that actually adds to the whole idea of inspiration and authority, because God just didn't take the easy way and whisper in somebody's ear. He went through human channels and he did it the human way and allowed it to be preserved. So let's shift our focus now a little bit and shift it over to the Gospels and ask the question: how, when, and why were the Gospels written? See, this is all now background information. Let's get our timeline straight here now. The epistles, the writings of Paul and Peter and John, were written first. They were written before the Gospels were written in all likelihood. Most of Paul's works, and probably Peter's as well, were written sometime between 49 and 65 A.D., before the Roman-Jewish war, where Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed again, with the exception of the book of Revelation. Revelation would have been written after that event, much later. So all of these were written in response to a specific set of circumstances, to answer specific questions and problems that were related specifically to the intended recipients. So the Epistle to the Romans is written specifically to the Roman Church, dealing specifically with problems and situations and circumstances that they were confronting there in Rome at that time. Now, most scholars agree that the Gospels then, the four Gospels, are written sometime between 70 and 90 A.D., after the epistles. There are some who believe that Mark's Gospel, was written earlier than that, maybe as early as 49 or 50 A.D., and ask the question, well, why? Why do they think that? Well, in fact, why were the Gospels written, period? And why did they wait that long, really? Because if Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead somewhere between 30 and 35 A.D., if you're taking an early date of 70 A.D., well, that's 35 years before the first one gets written down. Why did people wait that long? Well, the first generation of eyewitnesses by that time are starting to die off. The people that actually knew Jesus, walked with Jesus, talked with Jesus, were there when all of this happened. Those people are getting older now, and they're starting to die off. That's one reason why Tom Brokaw wrote his book, The Greatest Generation, is because the generation of World War II veterans were getting older and they were starting to die off, and their story had not been told. And he wanted to tell that story because it's a very, very important story to tell. I won't get into that right now, but over the last several years, especially when I worked hospice as a hospice chaplain, got around, especially here in Iowa, I began to run into those kinds of people and began to hear their stories because they wanted to tell them. And they're just totally, totally moving and inspirational. And so Jesus in his life and resurrection, even more so. And so the early church was transmitting, the church was growing, was spreading by oral tradition. People were verbally sharing the story. They were going out and saying, we are witnesses to this. That's what it means to be an apostle. Paul and others would say, we are witnesses to this, witnesses to the resurrection. And so that's how the church is spreading. Somewhere along the line, though, as these people are starting to die off, somebody realizes, whoa, if we do not preserve this, this whole movement is going to pass away because there's going to be no record of this. So, as long as the apostles, the first generation, were around and alive, there was no sense of urgency to get this stuff written down. But as that started to change, people's idea and thoughts on that began to change. Personal, and part of the problem too was that personal testimony, the oral tradition, my telling the story to you, is always more powerful than reading it and reading it as somebody else telling a story to you. First person experience, personal testimony, is always the most powerful means of communication and communicating an idea. But the importance of writing it down began to dawn on people. In fact, it was probably obvious. Probably somewhere along the line, people were saying, we ought to write this down, and yeah, we should do that. And nobody got around to it. So the Gospels, now we need to understand too, I believe, and a lot of scholars believe, the Gospels, the four Gospels as we have them, were not the first attempts to write down Jesus' story. If you go into Luke's Gospel and his prologue, the first 4 verses of the first chapter, he says that many have sought to set down an orderly account of Jesus' life. And so we believe what he's referring there to are earlier documents that are based on eyewitnesses' accounts. We call these pre-Gospels. And they were probably written somewhere, we're not really sure, but it could be as early as into the 40s AD, within 10, 15 years of Jesus' resurrection. And why don't we have those? Well, again, keeping stuff, preserving stuff from that era is very, very hard to do. And papyrus scrolls are very, very fragile. And I don't think the early writers realized the significance and the importance of what they were doing, of what they were writing down. One of the oldest scrolls we have of the New Testament, the scrolls from ancient times are called codex. And the oldest codex, one of the oldest that we have, is Codex Sinaiticus. And there's another one, Codex Vaticanus. And they're named after where they were found. Codex Sinaiticus was found amongst with other scrolls in a monastery in the area of Mount Sinai and being kept by in a Coptic Christian monastery by Coptic monks who had, over the centuries, lost the understanding of what they had. They had all of these scrolls, and they had since had forgotten how to read the language it was written in. And archaeologists went in, they found all these scrolls stored away, and there were some that were obviously missing, and they're going, what have you done with some of these? This seems like it's incomplete. And they said, well, on really cold mornings, we've used these to start our fires. They might have burned an original manuscript of the New Testament. Who knows? See, over the years it gets forgotten as to the significance of what they had. And so just little things like that, and things just get old. The reason we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are very, very ancient, they were placed in clay jars, and they were sealed, and they were in caves, which, pretty much climate controlled. And that's one reason why they were able to be preserved over centuries and centuries. But for a lot of this pre-gospel material, it just didn't survive. So Luke's gospel, for example, was probably written in the late 70s AD, maybe the early 80s. But it was written after Luke had done a careful study and careful research of the material that he had available to him. So what material did Luke have access to? Well, he probably had Mark's gospel. Most certainly, he had Mark's gospel. And he would have had some of the same material that Matthew would have used for his writings. And remember, Luke was the Apostle Paul's sidekick during part of the third missionary journey. So, if that's the case, he would be running into a variety of people that were part of the early church, and we don't know who he might have run into over his travels there. He might have run into Peter. We don't know how, Peter was still alive at that point, or various other members of the early church fathers. But his work, Luke's gospel, is addressed, if you look at the very first chapter there, it's addressed to Theophilus. Now, Theophilus is two Greek words together, which means God lover. And we have to ask the question, was that the actual name of someone who commissioned his writing? Or is it an actual code word or name for anybody who is reading this? Some people think that Luke was put together as confirmation material. And it could very well have been. And so he's just writing it he's assuming the person who's reading this is a God lover. And so he's addressing them that way. Just to remind you that if you go into Acts chapter 20, remember the book of Acts is written by Luke. Everything, when you're talking about Paul's missionary journeys, everything is referred to in the third person until you get to Acts chapter 20. And all of a sudden, the tense shifts to the first person plural. All of a sudden, Luke begins to refer to we did this, we did that, which means that at that point in time, Luke is with Paul at that time, with Paul and probably Silas as well. He became a sidekick. He probably was not before that time. So, now, getting back to the Gospels. As you read the four Gospels, and if you read them several times, and if you read them in what's called a harmony of the Gospels, where you have the three Gospels put side by side in columns so that you can compare them, and you can compare what's there. Got to have some coffee. As Johnny Carson used to say, good stuff. Wow. But as you read the four Gospels, several things stand out. You will see that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very, very similar to one another. Really very, very similar. There are differences, a lot of differences, but they all three paint a very similar portrait of who Jesus is. And they're referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic is one of those compound Greek words, a mashup. Syn means with, and opticus means to see with. In other words, they see with one another. And so we're going to deal now with what we call, in scholarship, the synoptic problem. The problem is, how do you figure out what the relationship is between those first three Gospels? And we look at only the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We don't look at John, because John is totally different. John is a totally different breed of cat when it comes to the Gospels. If you've read all four, if you haven't, I encourage you to do so. When you read John, you'll go, wow, are we talking about the same person here? Or are we dealing with the same thing? But just so you know, the first three Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels, and they're very similar. We'll see that now. For example, if you compare Matthew 24, verse 15, and Mark 13, verse 14, both of them are quoting Jesus, but both of them insert what we call an aside to the reader as a way of saying, you know what he's talking about here now, right? Don't you? Oh, let me just grab my own Bible here. Naughty boy that I am, teaching a Bible class, and I don't have my own Bible here in front of me. Let's see. Let's go back to that Matthew 24. Well, actually, here's Mark 13. So just happened to turn to that right off the bat. Mark 13:14. Jesus is talking, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, that let the reader understand, that's an aside. That's an insert. Jesus didn't say that. That's what the writer is putting that in. If you go over then to Matthew 24, and that's Jesus prophesying about the coming fall of Jerusalem in 24:15. Here we go. Jesus is speaking again. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoke of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the reader understand. Both of them have that same little insert there. So it's like, let the reader understand. You know now what Jesus is talking about. What Jesus is talking about there is he is predicting the fall, the destruction of Jerusalem that the Romans are going to accomplish in 70 AD. We know that because the Jewish historian Josephus writes in great detail about that conflict and everything that happens. Now, what is interesting is that both of the writers, Matthew and Mark, include this parenthetical aside, urging the reader not to understand this. Catch this, this is important. The idea that this is a coincidence, that both of them would have the same aside inserted like that, is so small it's silly to even consider it. Either one of them copied it from the other because he was using the other as a source, or they're using a common source. And this is not the only place where this happens. This is just one example. Verses and whole sections of verses are repeated within the three synoptic gospels, word for word. So part of the synoptic question then is, who copied from who? Well, let's get some basic information here. Of the three synoptic gospels, Mark is the shortest, 661 verses in Mark. Matthew is next with 1,068 verses. Luke is the longest, 1,149 verses. Now, you're not going to remember this, but this is just to give you an idea as to what we're talking about. 95% of the Gospel of Mark appears in Matthew. 80% of the Gospel of Mark appears in Luke. And 75% of Mark appears in both Matthew and Luke together. So there are verses in Mark. Are there verses in Mark that do not appear in Luke and Matthew? Yes, but only about 3%, which is pretty small. And there is material that appears in Matthew and Luke that does not appear in Mark, obviously, because they're both almost twice as long. Now, much of this material that does not appear in Mark are the sayings of Jesus. For example, the Beatitudes don't appear in Mark. It seems like either Mark didn't have access to that material, such as Matthew and Luke would have, or either didn't know about it, or he ignored it, or if Mark is writing down the words of Peter, Peter just didn't think to share it. Any of those are possibilities. So finally, there is also material that is unique to Matthew, and there's material that is unique to Luke. It doesn't appear anyplace else. So where did that material come from then? So material that is unique to each author, Mark has only 3% of Mark's gospel is unique to Mark. In Matthew, 20% of what he records is unique to him. Luke, 35%, over 1/3 of his gospel is totally unique to him. Now, the material that's shared by all three, and in scholarship we call this the triple tradition, material that is in all three gospels, Mark 76%, Matthew 45%, Luke 41%. The double tradition, where you have material that appears in Luke and Matthew that they share in common, Matthew 25%, Luke 23%. So, no, you're not going to remember that, but that's okay. But that just shows you the commonality between the three and why we call them synoptics. So, it's commonly believed if you pick up Luke and you go back into the first chapter of Luke, where he cites that there are many, he's done his research, and there are many sources that he has gone to. We believe that there were earlier writers who compiled Jesus' sayings, for example, recorded the birth narratives, which Mark has nothing to do with, and Matthew and Luke are the ones with the birth narratives. And remember, the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke are very, very different from one another. Matthew has the birth narrative according to Joseph, and Luke has the birth narrative according to Mary and Mary's line. And so, and also then the Passion. Those we believe are pre-Gospels, and along with Mark, who is basically the recording of Peter's oral tradition. We think that's the material that was used to make up the Gospels as we have them now today. Here we go. Now, so we have these pre-Gospels that precede any of the source material. So that's a part of the writing and the recording. Mark, we believe, Mark's Gospel is primary in the writing of the three Gospels. As I said, 55% of Matthew is found in Mark's Gospel. 42% of Luke is found in Mark's Gospel. So we think Mark was written first, and we think that Mark was a primary resource for Matthew and Luke. But there's another source there, because 25% of the material that's common between Matthew and Luke is not found in Mark. It's not there. The material that Matthew and Luke share are virtually all of the sayings of Jesus, including the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, and Jesus' words during his temptation. Now, this source is lost. German scholars back in the late 1800s refer to that source as Quelle, which that's the German word for source, and it's come to be known as Q, the material that Matthew and Luke hold in common, but is lost to us in its original form. Now, there is also material that is unique to Matthew, and this is called M, and material that is unique to Luke is referred to as L. 30% of Luke's materials are unique to him. 20% of Matthew's material is unique to him. So when we speak of M or L, there are hypothetical sources, and there could be multiple sources. We just don't know who those sources were, what those sources were. But to summarize, the earliest transmission of the stories of Jesus was the preaching of the apostles and other eyewitnesses. Soon those stories and those sayings began to be collected and written down. How soon, we don't know, but it stands to reason to me that something that important, that significant, people would not wait 30, 35 years to start writing it down. That was an age where the written word was starting to take on significance. That's why you had scribes that were writing things down. And that's, to me, that seems like if you have something as monumentally earth-shaking, life-changing as the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that puppy is going to start getting written down, and relatively soon. And it would be by people who were either eyewitnesses or heard the account from the eyewitnesses. Now, some of those people began to write down those accounts, and we refer to them as pre-Gospels. Mark records Peter's account of Jesus' life and ministry, probably as Peter is in jail waiting its execution in Rome. And he's an older guy. You say, well, maybe his memory has dimmed. Well, I don't think so because, if you go and talk to people in the nursing home, their long-term memory is usually pretty good. They may not remember your name 5 minutes from now, but they'll remember things that happened 50 years ago, just clear as a bell. And so I think that is a reliable explanation where Mark's gospel comes from. I think it's primary. I think it was the first one written, and it is the eyewitness accounts, the thoughts, the memories of the Apostle Peter. And so that's one reason why, in my own personal study, I prefer Mark before I prefer any of the other Gospels. Now, that's just my personal preference, knowing that, but that's where I come from. The Gospels, though, we need to remember, were not simply written to record the story of Jesus, but they were also recorded to pass that story on to a specific community or group of communities. John writes in his gospel, there are so many other things Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. That's what John says at the very end of his gospel. Each writer, though, chose the information to be included in his particular writing. Now, in John Mark's case, it was Peter's memories. Peter might have been sitting there reflecting, in his older years, says, yeah, I remember when. And Mark would write that down. And maybe it was kind of rambling. Maybe it wasn't a chronological account, except until you get to the crucifixion. But the other writings had a lot to do with the needs and the perspectives of their intended audience. So, well, what does that mean? Well, if you look at Luke chapter 6, verses 20 and 21, those are the Beatitudes. The blessed are those who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Okay, the Beatitudes. Well, if you look at Matthew, who also records the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, verses 3 and 6, they record the same saying, but they record it this way. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. That's a little bit different way of looking at it. It's possible that Jesus said both of those things at different times in different places. But it's also possible that the writers were interpreting those words different ways for their particular communities. Luke refers a lot to the poor and the marginalized, and that might have been his own particular passion, or the mirror through which he saw, or the lens through which he saw Jesus' concern. Matthew talks about the poor becoming poor in spirit. Luke, in his Beatitude, talks about the hungry, or those who hunger after righteousness, suggesting that he's writing for a rather affluent community. So the writers told the story in subtly different ways, and I think that was based upon the communities and the needs and their own convictions to which they were writing. So in other words, Matthew was probably writing for a more Jewish community. That's the thought. Luke, we're thought, is writing for a more worldly community, a more Greek educated kind of community, not Jewish, because you don't see a whole lot of Jewishness in Luke's gospel. So that's the filter through which the gospels come, we believe. Now, next time, we're going to take up the whole idea of John. And good old John. I love John's gospel. I love all the gospels. But John is just such a totally different breed of cat. And you'll see what I mean by that when we get into it next time. So, thanks for stopping by today for Sunday School. May the Lord bless you this day and throughout this week. Amen.